Okay, perfect. Thank you. Welcome to this session. The title, just to repeat it, is Facts in Fiction. I'm going to be talking with two of the most interesting and engaging writers of the year, Anjum Hasan and Devika Rege, about their novels, which are about navigating this new India that we are living in. So, without further ado, let's jump in. And 2014 is the year where your novel is set, the time, Devika. Now, this was a new mood came into the country at that time, and this is reflected in your novel Quarter Life. This new mood, a few years later, is what we find in Anjum's novel, History's Angel. Now, my question is a common one to both of you. What was it about the zeitgeist of these years that gave you the ideas for your novel? Where did you see that there's a novel in this time, or was the novel there and this seemed the right time to write it? Also, could you tell us a bit more about the titles that you have given your books?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you, Madhavi. Yes, I don't know if my character is navigating the new India entirely. That's a lot of space to navigate, but he is trying to navigate the streets of Old Delhi, at least, which is where my novel History's Angel is partly set, and partly in other bits of Delhi, but yes, very much Delhi. The zeitgeist is one that is longer and bigger and broader than just the years in which the novel is set. It ends in 2019, but I actually started writing this novel in 2017, picking up things that were going on, yes, from 2014, even before that. I think the zeitgeist is a tricky thing because you're trying to pull in things that are happening, and at the same time trying to write it as a conversation and not as a report on reality, you know? And it's very hard to avoid the obvious when you're writing a novel that is taking in the contemporary moment in a political sense, in a historical sense, broadly in a social sense. So I often think of this definition that it's one definition of the novel. I'm sure people will have others or will have questions about this definition, but I still find it very compelling, which is Walter Benjamin's idea of the modern novel starting with a man alone in a room thinking, which I still find very compelling because I think there is one history of the modern novel that is entirely that, from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground to, I don't know, Teju Cole's Open City. The tradition of the thinking man or woman, let's say, thinking person, and that's the tradition I find extremely exciting. So my Alif is a thinking person. He's not just sitting in a room, of course. He's a teacher of history to young children. He's in a family setup. He's in a domestic setup. He has friends. He has colleagues. He has lots of relatives. He's not a loner, but he is alone in his thinking a lot of the time. So to come back to your question about the zeitgeist and how do you write about the politics of the moment, I think what you try to do as a novelist is that person thinking alone in the room is also trying to have a conversation, right? He's not just in his own head, however much that is the trigger, that's the inspiration, that's, to me, the romantic image. It is also an attempt to have a conversation with all these points that I mentioned: the family, the school, the classroom, the staff room, where his colleagues are getting more and more narrow-minded, the streets of Delhi. It's an attempt at not foreclosing anything, but certainly setting certain limits on what is possible and what is not possible in the years leading up to 2019 in Delhi for a Muslim man who happens to be a teacher of history. So I think those are the enabling things, and those are the limits that I was setting myself. And yes, they attempt very much to write a novel as a conversation.
That's, I think, since Alif is a teacher of history, he's having a very long conversation with the past, probably more than with the future. But what about your novel, Devika? What would you say about what prompted you to make 2014 precisely the year in which you wanted to set your novel?
So,
Can you
Hello?
hear at the back?
yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, I think that the period in the run up to 2014 and 2014 itself was a kind of watershed moment. Of course, the history that propelled it into being started long before and has evolved in many different directions since. But I think one of the things that stood out to me at that time was, growing up in the middle class in India in the 90s and so on, your politics was really the 9 o'clock news. Some in the family went to vote, others didn't. It was that thing that happened in the poorer neighborhoods or then the uber elite. It was not something that happened in the residential societies. And there was something about that, the run up to that election. We had all these protests. The social media had exploded. The decade of protest was taking off. And suddenly our political identities became all-encompassing in some way. Like who you voted for determined how you were seen as a friend or a brother or a potential date. And so I think I was so intrigued by not just the fact that history was being made, and you saw this not only in India but in other countries as well. It really felt like this kind of moment of reckoning for democracy and asking yourself what the system of government stood for and what its limits were. And I think it was the psychology of that moment that really interested me and intrigued me. And to be very honest, even though this book is called the India book, and I agree with Anjum that there is nothing like an India book, it's always about that set of characters in that city or street or whatever it is. To think one is writing an India book is to fall into a certain hubristic trap that feeds the project you're trying to criticize, So, so for me at least, I think it was really just trying to speak to that zeitgeist from the point of view of the characters that I was writing. And to understand their psychology. And India or Mumbai or Maharashtra or Bandra, these were sort of only frames through which I was trying to understand something far more fundamental about human nature and what draws us to certain things. The other point I wanted to speak to, which you made, Anjum, was the history of one kind of history of the novel rooted in one man standing in a room alone and sort of seeing him through the end. And you trace that back to Dostoevsky, which is very interesting. Because for me, the Polyphonist novel also begins with Dostoevsky, except that it begins with the brothers Karamazov and not Notes from the Underground. And that is a novel that I was very influenced by, even while writing Quarter Life. It's an early novel that I read. And of course, it gets condensed, you see, with Faulkner, where, this idea of like multiple perspectives foregrounded as a structural device really becomes ubiquitous. And today, a lot of young writers just use it unthinkingly, including myself. But towards the end of the novel, or even midway through the novel, one of the questions I started asking is, all right, if this is such a democratic form that's giving more than one person a voice, who is left out at the end of it? Does giving everyone a voice result in a kind of moral relativism? Is this some kind of liberal utopia one is presenting, or does it actually represent discourse? So those were the kind of questions that kind of came in as I was writing and started to impact the structure of the work. But yeah.
Yeah, the Polyphonist novel. I don't know if there is any one in Anjum's book. There is Alif, who is clearly the person that you're listening to, and it's his story. But in your novel, Quarter Life, there is a whole bunch of people, and each of them has been. In fact, there are many voices and many conversations that happen in your novel, and in different settings. So now I would like to talk to you, ask you both about something about the settings that you chose. What was it about the set? Can you tell us something about the settings of your novel? Why did you choose them? Because setting is time, place, people, everything together, and would you sort of like to elucidate on that?
I have to come back to Dostoevsky since this seems to be like spirit hovering now already over this conversation, because I think absolutely Brothers Kamal, I'm just going to say Brothers K, because I always mispronounce that word. But the fascinating thing there is the idea of a novel as something where you can actually take the political debates of the moment, the religious debates of the moment, and put them in a novel and still have a dramatic, crazy, very, very energetic, even at moments very funny novel, and still feel something is at stake when the characters are having these conversations. Something is being attempted to be resolved through those conversations. And I think that still remains such an incredible touchstone for anybody trying to write a novel as a conversation. But the thing with Notes from Underground is that even that, though there's only one central character, you still feel that he's trying to talk to the world around him, to society, to the people he meets on the street, to the voices in his own head. So again, it comes back to what I said earlier, that however much it's solitary, it's still some attempt to engage. But to come back to your question about place, why do we set our novels in the places and the situations that we do? So, like I said, History's Angel is set in a very specific Delhi of a very specific era, which is now. And partly I was just doing it to see if I could pull it off, not being a native of Delhi, but somebody who is fascinated by the city, has visited, has parents who have roots in the city, and also trying to write a very, very North Indian urban story for which I felt Delhi would be the perfect setting. And when I say that, I think I mean two things in the case of this novel. One is partition. One of the things that Aleph is debating with himself, with what he calls, the sort of the great men of history, and he calls it history as nightmare because he's still debating it all these years later, is of course partition and the legacy of partition. And I thought that a man sitting in Delhi and doing that is way more consequential and powerful somehow than if you were doing it in anywhere else, any other city in the country. And of course, partition has different legacies in different parts of the country, but this is a very sort of a North Indian history that he's questioning, because his family has been affected by it. The family of his friends has been affected by the North-West Indian partition. So that's one thing. The other thing is that he feels himself also sort of trapped in a cliched idea of Muslim culture. And he lives in Old Delhi, and it's very, very visceral and tangible for him, because when he's walking near on Chandni Chowk or near Jama Masjid or in other parts of Daryaganj, he sees these busloads of tourists coming to do Old Delhi, right? And he sees himself being slotted as part of this old world Delhi Mughal, once Mughal culture, and he feels it very, very sort of a limitation on who he is. He doesn't see himself as belonging to what he calls the lighted stage on which Mughal culture has played out in this country, on Mughal stroke Muslim culture has played out in this country for 500 years or more. And again, that sort of ambivalence about being Muslim could only have been played out in Old Delhi, right? So those were some of the things, and also he's a history teacher. He wants his students to touch and feel and experience certain aspects of the North Indian past, and again, what better city to do it than Delhi? The very first scene of the novel is Aleph taking his students to see Humayun's tomb, and it's a disaster in many ways and sets the tone for the novel to take Aleph into very uncomfortable places, but it's still a grand thing for an 11-year-old, I think, or a 10-year-old, 9-year-old to see Humayun's tomb for the first time, and for Aleph, and he's been doing it for years, but it's still a thing that is new for him every time he does it. So these were some of the things I wanted to explore, see if I could do it in a way that's not of, the tourist to Delhi or the visitor to Delhi or that person sitting in that in that coach who's looking down on this local fixture, but to be the local fixture. And of course, you take advantage of the novelist's freedom. You're constantly having more fun than you should, than you should be, I think, as a novelist, because we can still write novels. If tomorrow we're told we can't, then party's over. But till the point that we can still write novels, we can take liberties like these and write about cities that we actually don't know as well as we pretend to.
No, I really loved the character of Alif, and you know, the way you get inside his head and the little slightly wicked observations that he keeps making of the world around him, which are so in character with, but are also amazing and startling for the reader. I'll throw the question back to you, Devika, about settings, because your book, like you said, has many voices. Why did you choose the particular setting of Bombay, Maharashtra in general for your book? And a little bit, can you tell us about the research which was required?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think one of the things that was important to me when I was writing this book, the subject of which in many ways is Hindu nationalism, is not to feed into any kind of notion that it is a monolith or in any way an essentialized kind of identity. It's one of those things that often creeps into our critiques, and it only serves what we are critiquing again. And I was very interested in how Hindu nationalism had manifested in a state like Maharashtra. It's a vast state, it's a wealthy state, it's very far away from the Hindi-speaking heartland. And so why is the headquarters of the Hindu right in Maharashtra and not in UP? And so these were the kind of questions that I wanted to ask. Or, there's a character called Omkar in my novel, who's a young man from Satara. As Anjum pointed out, there's not been partition trauma over there. The Mughals never occupied. We had Hindu rulers almost up till the British. There have not been any Bombay riots. So why is this man so obsessed with the Hindu national project? I almost feel the ideological project is more naked in places like this, because it cannot even be justified on the grounds of, certain kind of historical wounds, as it were, or whatever, one would like to claim. And so I personally found Maharashtra quite a fascinating case study. I mean, I'm also from there, so there was some, it started off from a place of intimacy, but the intimacy wasn't so high that I wasn't curious about why this project is taking off over here. And there are many, many answers for the questions I've asked, which are in the book. Everything from the kind of grassroots work that has been done to the way in which there's a wonderful book called Riot Politics by Ward Berenschot, which talks about how, why, like you would think after a riot in a particular area, the parties that have instigated it should fall because there's been so much loss, but they only get stronger and win the next election. And how, the Hindu and Marathi identity, Marathi man identity that has been in conflict for so long has in several places been flattened. We talked some time ago about how what the Hindu right loves to do is to flatten these identities. So we all believe we are an 80% and not, Maratha or Kunbi or this or that or the other. And so I think that is something that I found fascinating, the way so many little castes and subcastes have been triggered to construct this feeling of a majority. And the way all these dissonances between the Maratha project, the Marathi project and the Hindu nationalist project have been papered over, at least were in those years. Now you can see the fissures and cracks kind of coming up, which is interesting. One hopes for an implosion from within. And so those were aspects that I really wanted to talk about through the novel. Yeah.
You mentioned the word dissonances, and to me, when I was reading both your novels, we were looking for common themes. Dissonances probably have always existed in the form of prejudices, in various, in our society. But in your novel, Anjum, the prejudice comes right out as intolerance. This is something which we are seeing now. And, Alif is subjected to a lot of insults, which are open, which are veiled, and he struggles to maintain his dignity as just a very unambitious teacher of history in a school because he loves history. Now, you know, is Alif facing this situation simply as a result of religious discrimination, or is there a growing culture of anti-intellectualism, independent scholarship, which Aleph represents, you know, which does not kind of lend itself to a political agenda? Is this reflection there in your novel?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's an important question to ask. What gets sort of sidelined, marginalized, papered over when you live in a particular milieu where it feels like the debate is already settled, the polarization is so extreme that there's nothing to contribute to the discussion anymore. I think that's when novels become really important, because there's the hope that you can talk about the grayer things, the subtleties, the things that disappear in the larger political conversation. But having said that, I really want to emphasize that I don't write fiction to vindicate any point of view. And I haven't written Alif Muhammad, who I love as a character. Otherwise, I couldn't have lived with him for 5 years. I think he is very attractive in many ways, and I hope readers will think the same in his, in his love for the intellect, in his love for questioning, in his conversations with himself and with the world. But I'm not writing to vindicate the fact that somebody like him is victimized, and so I should defend him. I think he can defend himself. Right? So I'm not writing this as, in that sense, I'm not writing this as a political novel. It's not written to set the record straight or to score on behalf of my character. I think the character has problems of his own as well. Right? So for me, what's most interesting, I think, in times of political antagonisms of the sort that we're living through, is not what's happening out there in the political sphere, not what's happening in the TV debates, which are all the time playing in the background of Alif's parents' house when he goes to visit them, but what sort of inner corruption and inner maneuvering and inner compromises are the best people making? To me, that's more interesting. Even people on the right side of the fence, whatever the right side of the fence is for us, what are the side tracks or the little things that are going on in the hearts and the souls of those people? And in this case, of course, that's Alif. And for me, for instance, like for me, again, Dostoevsky, of course, Notes from Underground, what is the dark side of the soul of a person who is very, very committed to thinking through his times, right? So again, the best people, perhaps. For me, like the greatest novel I think about the Nazi era is not anything that sort of presents the horror or the evil in any dramatic way. It is Christopher Isherwood's Mr. Norris Changes Trains, which is, again, where the whole Nazi drama is very much in the background, but is a story of a man who's just taking advantage of the larger atmosphere of, you know, it's sort of morally a very, very shaky time, and so there are people who are able to take advantage of it beautifully, wonderfully, with like incredible sophistication, and I find that fascinating. What sort of ambivalent characters or ambivalent soulscapes are possible in a politically vitiated time? To me, that's the more interesting question as a novelist, rather than to say, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys, and let me raise my flag, you know, on behalf of who I think is right. That's, to say that is to already, then you have already written your novel on page 1, right? And I think the novel is only written on the last page. So otherwise there would be no point reading a novel, right? So yeah. That's that. I feel very strongly about ambivalence in fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if there's time for one quick.
We have 1 minute to end the session, so I don't think we'll have
am
time
so
for questions.
sorry. There's absolutely no time then to even ask the question and for them
Just
to.
have to wrap.
Yeah, so I will wrap this up by saying, please do read these books.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You have a minute.
Okay, I mean, there's no question, but I'd like to respond to what Anjum said. And very similarly, I mean, this work for me was not, it's hard to escape politics, but I think the intention was definitely not to write a polemical work, to take any stand of any sort over here. And I just want to say, I mean, Anjum said a lot of the things I would have liked to say, but just how hard that is sometimes as a novelist, because you are constantly torn between empathy and judgment, and one inevitably clouds the other if it's stretched for too long. And, and sometimes towards the end of the project, because novels take so long to write, it really begs the question at whose time and whose cost one has chosen to prioritize one or the other. And so I think those are some of the things we live with as novelists, but let's hope the outcomes, have something to offer that compensates for that.
Thank you. It is a short conversation, but I would urge everyone to read these, to carry the conversation further by actually reading these books. They are two of the most intelligent books written this year.
Thank you.